I didn't expect to become a ghost that night, Dot. It was a Wednesday, gray with drizzle. I remember because I had just put on her old hoodie, the navy one that swallowed me whole, the one that still smelled faintly of grapefruit and sandalwood. Her scent clung to the fabric like memory, like a lie that hadn't unraveled yet. I was curled up on the couch, legs tucked under me, half watching reruns, half scrolling through my phone. I'd left the kettle on the stove for tea I'd forgotten to pour. Everything was still, ordinary, until a notification lit up my screen. Love Now, Honest Voices, Women in Film. Sophia's name was in the subtext. Featured guest. I blinked. She hadn't told me about this panel, but that wasn't unusual. We'd been distant, not fighting, just ... muted. She'd been busy with her latest project, and I'd learned not to ask too many questions. Still, pride bloomed in my chest. Despite everything, I was proud of her. I clicked the link. The broadcast. Opened with soft lighting, an intimate audience, and 3 women seated in velvet chairs on a small stage. The host introduced them, her voice silky with reverence. Then she turned to Sophia, radiant in her ivory blazer and crimson lipstick, the same shade she used to leave on my collarbone. Sophia smiled, that magnetic, slow-lipped smile that once made me feel chosen. Then she spoke. For a long time, I was in a relationship that silenced me. I wasn't allowed to tell my truth, even in private. She said she loved me, but really, she loved the version of me that fit her need to stay. Hidden. It was suffocating. I paused, my stomach dipped. A strange heat climbed up my throat. She went on. There were journals I couldn't read, words I wasn't allowed to use. I had to shrink to make space for her fear. But one day I realized I had to leave to breathe. The audience hummed with empathy. And then, as if to cement her bravery, she pulled a folded sheet from her pocket. This is something I wrote after walking away. Except it wasn't hers. I recognized the first line before she even said it aloud. I used to wake up before her, just to listen to her breathe. It made me feel less alone in my own skin. That was mine, a poem I wrote during our 3rd month. Together, scribbled in a journal I never showed anyone but her. Words born in vulnerability, now hijacked. Rewritten her voice, she read the entire piece, eyes shining. The audience applauded. A few even stood up. My mouth was open, but no sound came out. My fingers had gone numb around my mug. I searched for an explanation. Maybe she'd asked me. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe this was some horrible mix-up, an accident, but I knew better. She didn't name me. But every line pointed to me, the quiet one, the closeted woman, the codependent ghost she'd left behind to find herself. She had stolen my words, but it was more than plagiarism. It was narrative theft. She'd reframed our love, made herself the survivor and me the shame. The feed panned to the audience again. I saw smiles, nods, tears. They were moved, because she was masterful, because she made betrayal sound like liberation, because she was beautiful and articulate and just enough broken to be applauded. I sat there, completely still, in her hoodie, the scent of her, the warmth of her, still wrapped around me like I hadn't yet noticed she was gone. I tried to move, but my limbs felt unfamiliar. My breath came shallow and fast, like I was drowning in a room with no water. I rewound the video, needing to hear it again, needing to disprove what I'd just seen. But there it was, my language, my grief, my voice spilling out of her mouth with practiced pain. And the world loved her for it. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there inside the cage of my own apartment, listening to the echo of myself. In someone else's spotlight, a strange, sharp thought cut through me. This wasn't heartbreak. This was erasure, and she didn't just leave me. She had rewritten me. She had taken my vulnerability, my privacy, my truth, and shaped it into her performance. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake watching the video loop in my mind. Her smile, her voice, the twist of the knife delivered with elegance and grace. It wasn't just the betrayal of a lover, Dot. It was the betrayal of a witness. She knew me. She knew what my words meant. She knew what staying silent had cost me, Dot, and now she was cashing in. The last thing I remember before I finally fell asleep, if you could call it that, was the red blinking notification on my screen. Replay available. Honest Voices with Sophia Westbrook. Honest, that was the word that broke me. I met Sophia at a poetry reading tucked inside a creaky secondhand bookstore on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like damp pages and cinnamon tea. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to disappear into someone else's words for a while. I was 26, still newly out, still learning how to speak in my own skin without apologizing. I wore black sweaters too big for me and kept my hair in a low knot so I wouldn't have to explain myself. My journals were my only mirror, filled with poems I never said aloud, thoughts I only whispered in the dark. I sat in the back that night, alone, listening, and then she walked in, Sophia Westbrook. Her name was spoken like punctuation. She was older, maybe mid-30s, all collarbones and confidence. She wore a mustard trench coat and red lipstick like armor. I remember watching her lean against a shelf of philosophy books, nodding at the poet on stage as if she were the editor of the universe. Afterward, she came straight up to me. No hesitation. You don't speak much, do you? I felt embarrassed. Like she'd caught me hiding, I shrugged. I watch, I said. She smiled like I'd given the right answer. You have a cinematic soul, she said. The quiet ones always do. And just like that, I was cast in her movie, Dot. We started slowly. Texts at first, long ones full of art references and stolen lines from poets we both loved. Sophia spoke, like everything was a monologue. I answered in ellipses in lowercase. Still she listened. Or seemed to. She came over one night with a bottle of wine and a camera. I wanted to take pictures of where you write, she said. I let her. She didn't laugh at my cluttered desk or the mug stained with ink or the stack of unsent letters. She called it art in its native habitat. I remember thinking maybe this is what it feels like to be seen. Eventually, she started sleeping over, then staying over. Then she never really left. She called it slow motion moving in. At first, it felt organic. Her toothbrush beside mine, her coat on my hook, her tea in my cupboard. We shared takeout containers and passwords. She edited my poems. I formatted her scripts. We wrote late into the night, back to back on the floor. I thought we were building a life. She said my silence grounded her. Said it was like being loved by the eye of a storm. She told her friends I was an old soul, a safe place, and I wore that like a compliment. But over time, I began to feel the pressure of her words pressing into the gaps where mine used to. B. She started quoting me casually in her pitches and interviews. My girlfriend says heartbreak isn't loud, it's ambient. She told a room full of producers once, and they all nodded like she was brilliant. That line came from a poem I wrote the night after our first fight. She'd cried on the bathroom floor. I'd held her for hours. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to embarrass her, because I thought love meant letting her shine later. When I asked about it gently, why she hadn't mentioned the line was mine, she laughed. We're a team, babe. There's no mine and yours, just us. And I wanted to believe that. I really did. That somewhere between script rewrites and film festivals, that us began to vanish. She started telling me to let her do the talking when we met new people. Said I was better in small rooms. Said my intensity put people on edge. I started staying home. I was the one who read her pitch decks, who cut her rough edits, who poured coffee at midnight and rubbed her shoulders while she paced. She began thanking me in the credits, not by name, but with things like, "To the quiet ones who hold the world together, dot." It was meant to be poetic. But I started feeling like a footnote in a book I never got to read. Friends began to notice. My best friend, Mariah, told me one night after too many drinks, "You love her like a lighthouse loves the sea." "All shine, no anchor," I laughed. But it stung. Another time, one of Sophia's exes, an actor she was still weirdly close to, cornered me at a party. She said with a half smile, "Just don't lose your voice in her story, okay? That's how it starts." I brushed it off, told myself they were jealous, told myself Sophia was just misunderstood. I told myself a lot of things. What I didn't tell anyone was how often I cried in the shower, how I stopped writing, how I'd stare at the blinking cursor on my screen for hours, wondering when I became. So afraid of being heard, I told myself love was compromise. That quiet wasn't the same as invisible, but over time, the silence I'd once worn like a soft sweater began to feel like a chokehold. Still, I stayed because she told me we were art, because she kissed my wrists when I flinched, because sometimes she'd look at me like I was her favorite frame in a film. She hadn't finished because I loved her, and I thought that was enough. The last thing she ever said to me before everything exploded was this: "You're the only one who's ever let me be loud without making me feel like I was too much." I smiled, but even then, part of me wondered, had she ever really heard me at all? When the screen went black and the applause faded, I didn't cry. Not right away. I stared at the blank television, remote still clenched in my hand. Her voice echoed in the walls, my words in her mouth, my pain packaged into poetry and sold. As survival, I stood up and threw the remote across the room. It cracked against the wall, batteries skittering under the couch. I followed it down, collapsed, crumpled, boneless with betrayal. I had no name for the feeling. It wasn't heartbreak. Heartbreak had form, had familiarity. This was something else. Like erasure with fingernails. Like being buried while still breathing. That night, I slept in fragments. I woke up gasping. Sheets twisted, jaw clenched. I could still hear her voice, that careful velvet cadence she used when she wanted to be believed, and the world did believe her. Of course they did. In the morning, the headlines were everywhere. Filmmaker Sophia Westbrook tells her truth. A brave voice for queer women silenced in the closet. Westbrook's vulnerable interview stuns the arts community. Vulnerable? I nearly laughed. It caught in my throat like smoke. For 3 days, I wandered my apartment like it was a crime scene. Every corner held her ghost. Her scarf still hung on the doorknob. Her mug, chipped and marbled with old tea stains, sat in the sink. Even her toothbrush was still in the drawer, soft and wilted. She hadn't taken anything. But somehow, she'd taken everything. I tried to call her once, twice, then 7 more times, straight to voicemail. I texted, "We need to talk. You used my poem. You used everything. No reply." Just the silence she once said she loved so much. On the 4th day, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Heavy cardstock, no return address. The kind of envelope that smells like expensive people. I tore it open, a formal invitation. Sophia's name embossed in clean serif type. A press event for the debut of her new documentary, Unspoken. The film she had once told me was too personal to show me. The one she'd said wasn't ready. Apparently it was ready now. I stared at the date. It was in 3 days, downtown. An indie theater she used to dream about screening at. My hands trembled. I almost threw it away, but I didn't. The night of the event, I sat in the back row. Hood up, heart pounding. The theater was packed. Industry types in vintage suits. Young artists with sharp haircuts. I recognized some of Sophia's old friends. I even spotted that ex, the one who'd warned me not to lose my voice. Too late. The lights dimmed. The host came out gushing over Sophia's unflinching honesty, her willingness to hold the mirror up to herself. Then came the applause, the rustle of people straightening in their seats. And then she walked out, Sophia, wearing a pearl white blazer that shimmered under the lights, her hair swept into a sleek bun, her lipstick a dark mauve, calm, powerful, untouchable. She looked every inch the woman the world wanted her to be. This film, she began, is about reclaiming your truth. It's about the stories we're told not to tell, the people we're taught to shrink for. It's for anyone who's ever felt invisible in their own relationship. The audience murmured with appreciation. It took me years to find this voice, she continued, hand to her chest. And now that I have it, I refuse to let anyone else define me again. And then the screen came to life. I didn't breathe for the first 2 minutes because I knew the story. It was my story. The voiceover began softly, Sophia, narrating, talking about a woman she loved. A woman who loved. Quietly, possessively. A woman who wrapped silence around them, both like a noose. Images followed, staged reenactments of dimly lit apartments. A solitary figure curled on a couch, blurred shots of a journal. Snippets of whispered poetry, my poetry. She didn't use my name, of course not. But she didn't need to. Anyone who had ever known us would know. Anyone who had read my writing. Anyone who had sat in our living room, watched us move around each other like kite and shore. This wasn't art. This was extraction. My breakdowns. My late night confessions. My deepest thoughts, the ones I shared in bed with her at 3 a.m. when her skin was warm against mine and I thought she loved me. Those moments were hers now, on screen, lit perfectly. Edited for dramatic tension, the narrative was slick. She was the victim. I was the metaphor, the obstacle. The lesson, I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout, this is a lie. But I couldn't move. I sat frozen, fingers digging into the fabric of the chair, legs numb, throat closed, and the worst part, they loved it. When the lights came up, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, tears in their eyes. Sophia smiled, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, took a little bow. Then the credits rolled. Produced by Sophia Westbrook, written by Sophia Westbrook, directed by Sophia Westbrook. No acknowledgments, no collaboration, no trace of me. I wasn't just erased, I was repurposed. Outside the theater, people stood in clumps, sipping cheap wine from plastic cups, praising her bravery, her depth, her vision. I stayed in the shadows, heart rattling inside my chest like loose change. Sophia emerged 20 minutes later, laughing with the host, thanking people for coming. I should have left. Instead, I walked closer, close enough to see her profile, her earrings, the slight flush in her cheeks from adrenaline and admiration. She looked happy, triumphant. She turned, and for a brief moment, her eyes found mine. They widened, just for a second, then narrowed. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply turned back to the crowd and said, loud enough for me to hear, thank you. This means more than I can say. I walked away, down the street, past a row of flickering neon signs, past a couple kissing under a lamppost, past everything we used to call ours. I walked until my feet ached. And somewhere in the cold, somewhere between heartbreak and fury, a new feeling stirred in me. Not grief, not helplessness. Not love, but something quieter, something sharper, something that said, she doesn't get to end the story here. I vanished without a trace. 1 week after the screening, I packed 2 duffel bags. I wiped my laptop, shut down my socials, forwarded my mail to a P.O. box I didn't intend to check. I left my keys on the kitchen table beside a note that simply read, keep it. I didn't say goodbye. Not even to Mariah. I couldn't stomach the conversations, the pitying glances, the well-meaning advice, the way people would say, at least it's out there now, like exposure was ever freedom. I boarded a northbound bus before sunrise. A 16-hour ride through mountains and silence. No phone, no distractions, just the sound of my breath and the miles ticking under me like some kind of slow resurrection. I moved into my cousin's spare room in a sleepy town somewhere between pine forest and fog. A town so small the corner store closed for lunch and people still read newspapers. She didn't ask questions when I showed up. Just handed me a key, made me tea, and said, heal how you need to. And I did, slowly, quietly. I walked every day, miles at a time, through trails carved into damp earth, past moss-covered trunks and wind-churned branches. I walked until the rhythm of my footsteps drowned out her voice in my head, until I stopped flinching at my own name, until I could finally look at a sunrise without thinking it needed to be written down. I cried without shame. Sometimes in the shower, sometimes at the smell of her perfume on a stranger, sometimes for no reason at all. I stopped trying to explain it to myself. I started writing again, but only on paper. In spiral notebooks I hid under my mattress like contraband. I wrote badly, angrily, beautifully, nothing performative. No readers in mind. Just me and the truth. My cousin would leave me snacks outside my door like I was a half-tamed animal. I loved her for it. One day, I wandered into the community library. It was raining. I'd been walking without an umbrella, soaked to the bone, and too numb to care. I just needed warmth. The woman behind the counter smiled. You're new, she said, as if I was a puzzle piece she'd been waiting to find. She told me about the writing circle that met every Thursday. It's small, she said, mostly old ladies and oversharers. But you look like someone who has stories. She had no idea. I showed up the next week, sat in the back, didn't speak, just listened. There was something deeply human in that little room. A folding table, a box of tea bags, 3 retired teachers, a man who wrote detective fiction and rhyme, and a teenage girl who only spoke in metaphors. They read their stories out loud, unpolished and raw, and nobody laughed unless the joke asked them to. The 3rd week, I brought a page. Just one, something I wrote years ago, before Sophia. Before everything. It was a paragraph about longing, about standing on the edge of something invisible, waiting to be named. I read it, voice shaking. When I finished, there was silence. Then the old woman beside me, Janice, who wrote only about crows, looked up and said, well, that hit me in the gut, and I broke, quietly, a single tear, a tremble in the lip, but it was enough. Because in that moment, I realized I still had a voice. I just forgotten how to hear it through the static of hers. I got a job at a cafe. Down the street, worked night shifts. Learned to make cappuccinos with leaves in the foam. People liked me because I didn't talk much. During the day, I took a part-time gig at a local print shop, binding signs, trimming paper, fixing jammed copiers. The owner, Helen, was a chain-smoking punk poet who ran the place like a halfway house for misfits. She paid in cash and let me take home scraps. Every week, I printed pieces of myself. Little essays, snippets of old poems, conversations I remembered, word for word, things Sophia had taken and distorted. I laid them out in chronological order. I color-coded our texts. I sorted screenshots, audio recordings, unfinished scripts. I created a map of the theft. It was like unspooling a crime scene. Only this time, I was the detective, not the body. The writing group started pushing me gently. You should send this somewhere, Janice said one evening. tapping her red pen against a poem I'd written about silence that tastes like cinnamon, or read it at the open mic. Someone else chimed in. We have one every month. Just across the street. No pressure, but people should hear this. I smiled. Nodded, shrugged it off, but inside something shifted. A low, slow rumble beneath the surface. It wasn't ambition. Not yet. It was something deeper. Older. A hunger to be seen. Not in the spotlight. Not in someone else's version of events. But as myself, fully, imperfectly, audibly. One night after work, I came home to find my cousin already asleep. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a crypt clock. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and pulled out a draft I'd been working on for weeks. A hybrid of memoir and poetry, the bones of what had happened. The things no one had seen, not the betrayal itself, but the erosion that came before, the shrinking, the silence, the surrender. I stared at the pages, at the ink that bled slightly from the corners, at my own handwriting, furious and fragile, and for the first time since Sophia's voice echoed through that TV, I thought maybe I could tell it first. Maybe I could tell it better, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the girl I used to be, sitting in the back of that bookstore, believing that someone loving your silence meant they understood it. It would take months to admit what. I wanted to plan to research to gather the fragments of myself that were still sharp enough to cut. But I wasn't gone anymore. I had vanished, yes, but now I was coming back not as a shadow, not as a stolen voice, but as the woman who survived it and still had something left to say. I didn't write it to be read. Not at first. I wrote it to survive, not poems this time. No metaphors to hide behind. I didn't need to make it pretty. I needed it to be real. I titled it The Woman Who Watched Her Story Walk Away. It wasn't about Sophia. Not entirely. It was about the space I made for her. The way I shrank so she could stretch. The things I let her take, first with permission, then with entitlement, and finally with silence. It was about the parts of me I abandoned so she could shine. And how, when she left, I mistook the echo of her absence for my own worth. Each chapter peeled back another layer. The first time she plagiarized a phrase of mine in a panel interview, I laughed. I said, "It sounds better in your voice anyway." The first time she told me to wait outside while she pitched our project to a producer, I held her coffee like a child, waiting for their parent to come back. The first time she looked me in the eye and said, "I made this, don't ruin it." I wrote that line 6 times in a row, until the pen nearly tore through the page. Don't ruin it. As if I could ruin what? I'd helped build. As if silence wasn't already erasure. I wrote for 6 hours a day. In the morning, before work. At night, under a dim lamp in my cousin's guest room. My notebooks turned into binders, then into Google Docs. I printed drafts and marked them with red ink, arrows, marginalia that read, "Too careful." Tell it straighter. I wasn't gentle with myself. I confessed how often I'd apologized to keep the peace. How long I ignored the warning signs. How much I had clung to her version of me because it felt more important than living in my own. But the truth? The more I wrote, the more I remembered who I was before she named me. And that woman, the one who loved language, who whispered poems into voicemail, who stayed up late revising essays just to get one sentence, right? She deserved to finish. The story. I sent the manuscript to a small indie press that published hybrid memoirs and experimental work. They didn't ask for resumes, just heart. I submitted under the name A.E. Hollow. Hollow, like the echo left behind when something is taken. A name built from the silence she once mistook for consent. Weeks passed. I told no one. Then, one rainy morning before my shift at the cafe, I checked my email and saw the subject line, We love your voice. Invitation to read at Summit. I stared at the screen, reread it 3 times. I thought maybe it was spam or a prank, but it wasn't. It was real. They were inviting me to read a chapter live at their annual storytelling summit. In front of an audience. A microphone. A name on a program. And the summit. It was being held in the same city where her new documentary was debuting. The same weekend, a block away. I left. Sharp and breathless, of course. Of course it would be there. Booked the flight that night. Non-dash refundable. One way. No room for retreat. I bought a charcoal gray suit, clean lines. No frills. It fit like intention. Inside the hem I stitched. A square of the hoodie I wore the night. She left me on the couch with my own words playing on the screen. A reminder of who I used to be. Of the softness she tried to bury. The woman who didn't scream. Not because she lacked rage, but because she had been taught silence was safer. No more. I packed my manuscript. Then I gathered the rest. Printed emails, highlighted texts, scanned notes, voice memos transcribed. Not to use. Not as a threat, but as evidence of what I had seen. Of what I had survived. Of what I now claimed as mine. The flight was quiet. I didn't listen to music. Didn't read. I sat by the window and watched the sky turn to clouds, then back again. At the hotel, I laid out the suit, ironed every crease, slid the voice memos into my binder. Practice reading out loud, not with emotion, but with clarity. Power didn't have to be loud. That night, I walked the city blocks near the summit venue. I passed a glowing theater marquee bearing her name in large. Serif font. Sophia Blackwell. The Art of Becoming. It was sold out. I stood across the street, watched strangers file in, laughing. Some carried programs. Some wore shirts with her latest. Quote silk screened across the back. To own your voice is the bravest thing a woman can do. I nearly vomited because I knew the voice that line came from. Mine. Verbatim. The next day. The summit buzzed with energy, hopeful and earnest. There were young writers with chapbooks tucked under their arms. There were older women holding space for truths that took decades to speak. The room I was assigned to was small. Maybe 50 chairs, a mic, a simple podium. Nothing theatrical. And yet, I'd never felt more electric. I pinned my badge to my lapel. A. Ihalo, below it, featured reader. The host introduced me with kindness, but not reverence. It grounded me. When I stepped to the mic, I could feel my heartbeat in the soles of my feet. But I wasn't shaking, not anymore. I opened the manuscript, took a breath, and read. There is a moment when you realize you've become background noise in your own life. That's how it started, not with betrayal, but with quiet. The kind that feels like a hand over your mouth, dressed up as affection. The room stilled. I thought love meant letting someone interpret me, translate me, frame me like a photograph they could sell. I let her do it, again and again, until I couldn't hear myself without her voice inside it. I watched their faces, the sharp exhales, the tears blinked back, the subtle nods from strangers who recognized something inside my words. She said I was lucky to be near her brilliance, but I was the spark, the match, the fire she carried in her palms and never gave credit to. And when she burned it all down, she walked away from the ashes like they weren't even mine. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Then came the applause, not loud, but long, a kind of reverence I hadn't expected. Not for performance, but for truth. Afterward, people lined up. One woman pressed my hand and said, "That chapter, it was me, 10 years ago." A young man whispered, "Thank you for saying it plain, for not making her the villain, for making you the hero." And someone else, a teacher with silver streaks in her hair, leaned close and said, "You could have screamed, but you told a story instead. That's power." I walked out into the cool night, binder in hand, suit collar open. Across the block, Sophia's screening had just ended. People milled about outside. Laughter, flash, photography, hugs. I saw her from across the street, still glowing, still talking with her hands, still beautiful in the way that poison can be beautiful. She didn't see me. I didn't need her to, because this time I saw myself. The city had changed, or maybe I had. Either way, the buildings no longer looked like monuments to her. I arrived early to the venue, not to prepare, but to remember. This was the same stage where she once screened her debut film, where she stood under soft lighting and talked about empathy while I waited backstage holding her coat out now. I walked through the doors alone. The suit I wore was charcoal gray, fitted but soft in the shoulders, like armor made of memory. Inside, the lining, stitched near the heart, was a swatch of fabric from the hoodie I wore the night she broke me on live television. Around my neck hung an olive leaf necklace, the only thing I had left from my mother. My hands were steady. A volunteer handed me a program. My name was printed last, the final speaker. Not a warm-up act, not a footnote. The final voice backstage. The lights cast long shadows. I could hear applause through the curtain. The speakers before me had shared incredible things, stories of survival, discovery, loss. And yet, my body was vibrating with something else. Not nerves, readiness. They called my name. Not the name she once edited from the acknowledgments of her film. Not the name she buried in metaphors. My name. Full, unapologetic dot. I stepped into the light. The crowd was larger than I expected. Rows upon rows. Warm faces beneath dim chandeliers. And near the back, Sophia. I felt her before I saw her. She sat beside a younger woman, probably a producer, or maybe her new muse. She didn't expect me. I stepped up to the microphone. My voice, when it came, was soft. They called me. Invisible. Silence. Not out of disinterest, but attention. I took a breath. Began to read out the pages I held were thick, printed, double-spaced, black ink on soft ivory. I read a poem, one she had once performed on a podcast, calling it an anonymous submission. Then a passage from an old journal entry, the one she'd paraphrased in her documentary voiceover. Then another and another. The crowd didn't stir. I didn't name her, but I didn't have to. Every metaphor pointed to her. Every line she ever said in interviews, I showed them the roots. The silence behind them. I told the story of the woman who had been asked to be quiet, to stay behind the camera, to let the others shine. I told it slowly, like opening a locked room. Halfway through, I looked up. Sophia's face was pale. She wasn't taking notes. She wasn't whispering to her assistant. She was just dot there, frozen. I closed the binder, unclipped the microphone from my collar. Some people say silence is strength, I said, holding the mic in my hand like a stone. But mine was survival. Until now. I turned to the host and handed them a USB drive. Please play this. The screen behind me flickered to life. The audience shifted. First, a screenshot of a message. Sophia's name above it. Can I use the line about the storm in my short film? It's perfect, babe. Then an audio clip. My voice late at night in our apartment, raw, whispering, describing what it felt like to be forgotten while lying next to someone. Then another, a video log. Me, tear-streaked, narrating the exact monologue Sophia later delivered in a festival. Keynote. The room didn't gasp. They absorbed it. Every frame. Sophia stood. She reached for her bag. Her eyes scanned for an exit, but the aisle was blocked. Cameras were rolling. This wasn't just a reading. It was a reckoning. I didn't flinch. I stood still as she tried to disappear. The audience watched her move and then turned back to me. They didn't need a villain. They needed a witness. When the slideshow ended, I stepped forward one last time. This isn't revenge, I said quietly. This is restoration. I am not erasing her. I am reclaiming me. I didn't bow. I didn't thank them. I simply nodded and walked off the stage. Outside, the air had a bite to it. The city buzzed. Around me, taxis honking, wind lifting stray flyers off lampposts. I reached into my coat and pulled out the binder. Held it against my chest for a moment, then I sat on the steps of the venue. People passed by. Some recognized me. No one interrupted. I didn't need their applause. I watched the clouds move across the sky, breathed in, breathed out. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt real. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding in someone else's frame. I was here, fully. She called me invisible. But today, I said my name, and this time they listened.